In an abandoned monastery in Derbyshire, as daylight sliced through a cracked stone wall, a haunting carving emerged a nun, gently touching the head of a black-horned horse. But that was only the beginning. From that moment on, Becca heard hoofbeats every night and dreamed of a forbidden love whispering through time. A skeleton, a heart split in two, and a chilling inscription, "They wouldn't let me love, but the horse understood." This isn't just history, it's pulsing through the present. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next haunting and emotional chapters we bring to life. This story begins on a quiet morning among cold stone walls where the past had never truly gone to sleep. The morning air in Derbyshire was thick with mist, the kind that clung to everything, turning the world into a soft, muted blur. The tufts of grass beneath their boots were damp, the soil cold from the long night. Becca's breath puffed in tiny clouds, her hands trembling slightly from the chill as she adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag. The towering silhouette of the abandoned monastery loomed ahead, its stone walls weathered and scarred by time, as though it had been abandoned for centuries rather than just a few decades. The group of archaeology students behind her seemed almost dwarfed by the ruins, their voices low, their movements measured. Becca's footsteps were steady, deliberate, but there was a subtle hesitance to her pace. She had been here before, yes, but never in this capacity. Her mind, usually sharp and alert, felt foggy, caught between the rawness of the landscape and the weight of the moment. Her dissertation loomed over her, a study about the symbolic meanings hidden within architecture. But the cold, ancient stone in front of her seemed to whisper its own kind of secret, one she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. "Becca," called Sarah from behind her, snapping her out of her reverie. Sarah's voice was sharp, practical, always pragmatic. "Are you all right? This place gives me the creeps." Sarah's skepticism was evident in her tone, but Becca offered a tight smile and nodded. "Fine," Becca replied, her voice barely rising above a whisper as she motioned toward the looming entrance. "Let's get started." The team, consisting of 5 students in total, gathered their tools, set up their equipment, and began the laborious task of analyzing the crumbling stone wall of the cloister. Becca's eyes lingered on the structure, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her notebook. The monastery had been abandoned after a fire years ago, and what was left of the place had since become a ghost of itself, quiet and still. The stones were worn, centuries of neglect, visible in every crack and crevice. As the group began to break apart the stones, the sound of their tools clinking against the weathered surface echoed through the silence. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old stone, the sun barely making a dent in the grayness of the day. It was a landscape of forgotten stories, and Becca found herself wondering if they would uncover one of their own. It didn't take long for their work to reveal something unexpected. As one of the students chipped away at the wall, the sound of their tools striking something solid but different rang through the air, sharper than the usual clink of metal on stone. The group paused instinctively, gathering around to inspect. The stone gave way to reveal a carving, faint but unmistakable. The figure of a woman, clearly a nun from her habit, was depicted in intricate detail, her hand gently resting on the head of a black horse. But the horse was no ordinary creature. It had a pair of horns protruding from its forehead, a stark contrast to the smooth lines of the nun's form. It was bizarre, out of place, and entirely unfamiliar to them. "What the hell is this?" one of the students muttered, crouching to get a closer look. The others exchanged glances, but no one seemed to have an answer. The image seemed almost too surreal to be real. A nun known for their vow of chastity and self-restraint was shown not only with a horse, but one so bizarre with horns. The juxtaposition was enough to make anyone question the origins of the image. Was it a symbol of something darker? Or simply an anomaly, lost to time? Becca's heart began to race. The carving called to her in a way she couldn't explain. It felt familiar, yet impossibly strange. The very essence of it unsettled her. "Maybe it's a mistake." Sarah's voice broke through the tension. She stood off to the side, arms crossed, an air of disbelief in her stance. "This has to be some kind of fantasy element someone carved into the wall. Why would a nun have anything to do with a horned horse? It's ridiculous." Becca didn't look at Sarah as she spoke. Instead, her gaze stayed fixed on the carving, her mind already whirring with questions. Was this a representation of something forbidden? Something lost to time? Or was it an artistic flourish, the work of a monk or artist, desperate to bring a sense of life to the stone? "I don't know," Becca murmured. "But I don't think it's a mistake." She stepped closer, reaching out to trace the edges of the carving with her fingertips. The stone was worn smooth, but the details small and deliberate seemed to echo through the centuries. There was something haunting about it, something that sent a shiver down her spine. The rest of the group, including Sarah, were still caught up in their initial skepticism. Sarah stood a little apart from the group, shaking her head in disbelief. She crossed her arms tighter, her stance rigid. "It's probably nothing." Sarah repeated, her voice sharp with doubt. "Why do you have to make everything so mysterious, Becca? It's just a carving. It doesn't mean anything. We're here to do serious research, not play detective." Her words stung, but Becca didn't let them show. She turned to face Sarah, her brow furrowed in thought. The skepticism in Sarah's voice, the dismissive tone, something about it didn't sit right with Becca. Was it just cynicism, or was there something deeper at play? Maybe Becca replied quietly. But what if it does? It wasn't an answer. It wasn't meant to be. Becca didn't need to convince anyone but herself. But there was a stirring in her chest, a feeling that they had just uncovered something far more complex than they'd bargained for. And as the whispers of the past began to pull at her, Becca knew this was only the beginning. The rest of the team moved on to their next task, but Becca stayed by the wall, her mind already drifting to the next steps. Something about that carving about the nun and the horned horse was personal, deeply personal. And Becca knew instinctively that she had to uncover the truth. She had to understand what it meant. The wind howled outside, rattling the cracked windows of the ancient structure. And Becca, staring at the stone before her, couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. Something long buried that would soon come to light. The walls of the monastery had secrets, and they were starting to speak. As Becca turned away to join the group, a feeling settled in her stomach, something unexplainable. It was as if she had just opened a door to something ancient, something that had been locked away for centuries. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't just here for her dissertation. She was here for something much bigger than that. Something that was about to change everything. The group continued to their work, unaware of the turmoil brewing just beneath the surface. But Becca knew that this discovery, this carving, would lead her to a truth that would challenge everything she thought she knew. And it would push her and her relationships into unknown, dangerous territory. Becca lay in the old tent, the night blanketing everything in a thick, damp fog. She couldn't sleep. The air, cold and damp, made her shiver, but it was the unease in her heart that kept her awake. Only a few hours earlier, the archaeological team had uncovered the strange carving in the wall, and now the image of it, the nun and the horned horse, repeated in her mind like an endless loop. She couldn't shake it. Then something invaded her thoughts. An image flashed in her dream. Becca found herself standing in a vast space, a cathedral with towering stone walls surrounding her. The light from flickering candles cast eerie shadows across the room, filling the air with a sense of mystery. She saw a woman cloaked in black robes, her face obscured in the dim light, but the glow from the candles reflected off her features, making her appear strangely distant. The woman, with eyes filled with an indescribable sadness, stepped closer to Becca, extending her hand to gently caress the head of a black horse standing beside her. The horse, with two unusual horns sprouting from its forehead, bowed its head, and its eyes locked with Becca's, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't understand. The sound of the horse's hooves echoed throughout the space, rhythmic and strong. That sound wasn't just a noise, it seemed to cut through the night, resonating deep within Becca's soul. She felt an overwhelming sense of fear. The stillness of the night was pierced by the thundering hooves, and Becca jerked awake in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, her eyes wide with terror. The dream had left her shaken, the sense of dread lingering in her chest. This wasn't the first time she had experienced this. Every night the strange images invaded her sleep, leaving her in a state of unease, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't deny it either. There was something about this dream, the nun, the horse that called to her. It felt important, as if it was trying to tell her something she was supposed to understand. Her inner conflict grew stronger. She couldn't ignore the vividness of the dreams, nor could she brush aside the emotions they evoked. They seemed illogical and nonsensical, but to Becca they felt deeply real. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something beyond the dream itself. Was there a mysterious connection between the nun and the horse? How could it be that a nun sworn to chastity and self-restraint was somehow linked to a creature as wild and untamed as a horned horse? Becca began to question her own sanity. How could a rational person even entertain such thoughts? And yet every night she found herself drawn back into this mysterious vision, each time hoping to unravel its meaning. The images of the horse and the nun became a recurring theme in her dreams. The horse with its horns was not just a bizarre creature, but a symbol of freedom restrained and trapped in a world that would not allow it to express itself. And the nun standing beside the horse carried a secret, a love forbidden, a desire that had no place in the sacred walls of the convent. The more Becca dreamed, the more she began to feel the weight of their pain. Pain from an unspoken longing, from a love that could never be expressed. For Becca, these weren't just dreams. They were messages, cryptic signals from a past long buried. Something was trying to be revealed to her, and though the fear gnawed at her, she knew she couldn't ignore it. These dreams weren't random. They were part of a story, one that hadn't been told yet, one that she needed to uncover. Each night the visions became clearer, more intense. And each morning she woke up feeling heavy-hearted, carrying questions with no answers. Could she face the truth that these dreams were leading her to? Or would she remain trapped in an endless nightmare with no resolution? Becca had always been drawn to the untold mysteries of the world. But this was beyond anything she'd imagined. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the cave, the dampness clinging to her skin like a second layer. The walls of the cave were slick wet with years of moisture that had seeped in their surface, marked by the passage of time. The faint light from her lantern flickered against the shadows, casting long, distorted shapes on the jagged rock. Becca felt a slight unease creep up her spine, but it was the lure of discovery that pulled her forward deeper into the darkness. The rest of the group had remained behind, focusing on their excavations near the ruined walls of the monastery. Becca had always felt like an outsider among them, more absorbed by the history hidden in the earth than by the academic pursuits that were supposed to matter. She needed to know the truth. It was a feeling deep inside her, a need to understand, to unearth what had been buried for so long. And so she ventured farther until she reached the heart of the cave. The space opened up before her wider and emptier than she had anticipated. But it was something on the floor that caught her eye, something that made her blood run cold. A pile of bones. At first she thought it was just a random scattering, maybe from an animal that had wandered into the cave. But as she stepped closer, the unease turned to shock. The bones weren't just any bones, they were human. And beside them, impossibly, were the bones of a horse. The remains of a woman and a horse lying together in an embrace that defied the natural order. Becca's heart skipped a beat, the air in her lungs suddenly thick. Her hand shook as she reached out to touch the cold surface of the bones, her fingers brushing over the smooth, hollow skull of the woman. Her mind raced. How was this possible? Was this a ritualistic burial? Had these two beings, human and animal, been buried together for some profound, unspoken reason? As she crouched down, her gaze fixed on the delicate bones of the horse, she noticed something that made her stomach churn. A piece of wood half buried in the dirt near the skeletons caught her eye. It was old, weathered, but still legible. Slowly, carefully, Becca reached for it, her hands trembling. The wood creaked as she lifted it, revealing a deep, etched message. The words were simple, but they struck her like a blow to the chest. They wouldn't let me love. But the horse understood. The words seemed to pulse in her hands, the weight of them pressing into her chest. The message was raw, emotional, painful. Becca swallowed hard, feeling her heart tighten in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't look away. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her with a force she hadn't been prepared for. The words were not just a confession. They were a plea. A cry for a love that had been forbidden, for a connection that had been lost to time. She lowered her head, trembling, the weight of the discovery heavy in her bones. This was more than just an archaeological find. This was a human story, a tragic one. A secret that had been buried for centuries. The nun, the horse, the forbidden love. It all made sense now. Or perhaps it made too much sense. The connection between the two, how the woman in her isolation had turned to the only creature that could understand her, the only one who could offer her the love she was denied by her vows. Becca's fingers traced the rough etching on the wood, her mind racing with questions. Why had this been kept hidden? What had the rest of the world missed? And why had the past chosen her to reveal its truth? She needed time to process this, to understand the full implications of what she had found. It was too much, too overwhelming. But she knew that she couldn't leave this cave without doing something, anything, to honor what she had just uncovered. With a deep breath, Becca stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She knew she had to bury this discovery. The bones. The message. She had to protect the secrets to ensure that the past remained undisturbed. But as she knelt beside the remains, carefully covering them with dirt, the weight of her decision began to settle in. She was hiding the truth. She was hiding the very thing that could explain the mystery, that could reveal the connections between the nun and the horse. And yet, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was doing the wrong thing. That somehow she was betraying the woman in the grave, betraying the truth that had been locked away for so long. Catalyst, David's challenge. It wasn't until much later, when Becca had returned to the group, that the weight of her decision fully hit her. The others hadn't noticed her absence at first, too absorbed in their own work. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruins, Becca's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Becca David's voice was calm, but laced with curiosity. "You've been gone for a while. What did you find?" Becca froze. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, but there was David standing just behind her, his gaze piercing. She could feel the weight of his question hanging in the air, a heavy silence between them. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. How could she explain what she had found? The bones, the message, the grief that still clung to the air in the cave. I didn't find much." Becca stammered, her voice unsteady. "Just some old bones. Nothing important." She tried to sound casual, but her heart was racing, and she could tell David wasn't convinced. David didn't let her off so easily. "You're lying," he said softly. "I can tell. Something's changed. I've seen the way you've been acting since you came back. You're not the same." Becca's stomach twisted. She had never been able to hide anything from David. He had always been the one to see through her carefully constructed facades. "David, please." Becca whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't talk about it." But David wasn't going to let her off the hook. He stepped closer, his expression intense. "Why? What's so bad that you can't share it? What did you find?" Becca's mind raced. Her thoughts scrambled, but all she could feel was the heavy weight of the secret she had buried both in the cave and in her own heart. She didn't know if she could keep this hidden. She didn't know if she could continue lying to herself. David's voice softened, almost pleading. "Becca, whatever it is, you don't have to keep it to yourself. You don't have to carry this alone." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Becca felt a pang of something deep inside. It was fear, yes, but also something else. Something she hadn't expected. The truth she had hidden, maybe it didn't need to be kept a secret anymore. The weight of secrecy had started to pull Becca in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the quiet whispers of her own mind. It was the deep gnawing feeling that her silence, her unwillingness to share the truth, was somehow wrong. The discovery she had made in the cave was not just an academic one, a historical find to be catalogued and filed away. It was a living, breathing story. It was about love, forbidden love, and a grief that had echoed through the centuries. Every night since the discovery, the guilt grew heavier. Becca lay awake, staring into the darkness of the tent, the cold air seeping in through the thin walls. Her thoughts were a constant swirl, a cacophony of regret and sorrow. She had known the moment she found the bones, and the message that this was something more, something deeply personal, deeply tragic. But she hadn't realized how much it would affect her, how much it would dig into the very core of who she was. The truth. The truth she had buried beneath the earth, beneath the bones, felt like it was starting to crush her. Each passing day added to the weight. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the grave, the nun who had given up everything. Her vows, her life, her purpose for the love of a creature who could never return that love in the way she needed. The horse had understood. But what did that even mean? What had been so powerful about the connection between the two? And why had it been hidden? Silenced? Buried? It wasn't just the discovery of the bones that haunted Becca. It was the realization that in her silence, she was perpetuating the same cycle of repression that had forced this woman to live a life of unspoken yearning. She couldn't understand it fully, not yet, but she could feel the sorrow of the nun in her bones. She could feel the weight of a love lost to time, a love that had never been allowed to flourish. As Becca lay there in the darkness, she was pulled back into the dreams. The dreams had come every night since she found the remains, dreams of the woman of the horse. And this time it was more vivid than ever. She saw the woman in the habit again, walking away from the convent, her eyes fixed on Becca, as if she were calling to her, beckoning her. The image of the horse followed close behind its hooves, striking the ground with a sound that resonated deep within Becca's chest. The horse, the one with the horns, had become more than just an animal. In her mind, it was a symbol of freedom, of a yearning that could never be fulfilled, of a love that had been denied. The woman's eyes pierced Becca's soul, her gaze filled with a desperate, silent plea. The image of the horse beside her, so powerful, so majestic, yet so tragic, seemed to reflect the very essence of what had been lost. What had been stolen by the walls of the convent, by the vows that had bound the woman. The horse wasn't just a companion. It was the embodiment of her desire, of the part of her spirit that had been caged, the part that had longed for something beyond the rigid confines of religious devotion. Every night the images became clearer, more haunting. Every night Becca felt the woman's presence, felt the pull of the unspoken love that had transcended the boundaries of time, of space, of life itself. And every night she woke up with the same overwhelming feeling of guilt. She wasn't just the keeper of a secret. She was complicit in its silence. She had discovered it, yes, but she had buried it. She had hidden it. And now she couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow part of the tragedy. That by keeping this truth from the world, she was ensuring that it remained trapped in the past, lost to history. Symbolic imagery. It wasn't just the guilt that haunted her. It was the symbolism, the image of the horse, the nun's broken love, the secret she had kept from the others. Each night when she closed her eyes, she saw the horse, its eyes wide with unspoken longing. It wasn't just the creature itself. It was what it represented, a love, unfulfilled, a desire so deep that even time itself couldn't erase it. The horse had been the woman's only companion, her only outlet for the emotions she was forbidden to express. In a world where she was expected to deny herself, to suppress her feelings, the horse had been the only one who could understand her, the only one who could give her a semblance of solace. Becca couldn't shake the image of the horse, its dark, haunting eyes always staring at her through the fog of her dreams. She felt as though she were becoming the horse in her own mind, trapped in a cycle of repression, unable to escape the weight of the truth she had uncovered. The horse wasn't just a symbol of freedom. It was a symbol of all that had been lost, all that had been denied. It was a reminder of the love that had been silenced, a love that had burned bright in the face of all obstacles, only to be buried beneath layers of stone and silence. Moral conflict. Becca stood in front of the mirror one morning, her reflection staring back at her. But she barely recognized the person looking at her. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles under them. Her shoulders sagged with the weight of the secret she carried. She had been trying to focus on the work, to push through the days, but the guilt gnawed at her, a constant companion. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the cave, the love that had been denied, the life that had been lived in silence. She could feel herself slipping, as though she were losing touch with the very person she used to be. She had always believed in the importance of truth, of uncovering the hidden stories of the past. But now she wondered, was she helping by keeping this secret buried? Was her silence a form of complicity? The truth was right there under her fingertips, and yet she had chosen to hide it. And worse, she had told herself that it was for the best. She had convinced herself that this truth wasn't hers to tell, that it wasn't her place to disturb the past. But now, every night the guilt tore at her. Every dream she had was a reminder that by hiding the truth, she was perpetuating the same cycle of repression, the same denial of love that had marked the nun's life. Was she protecting the past? Or was she simply afraid of facing the consequences of what she had discovered? Becca didn't know anymore. What she did know was that every time she tried to bury the truth deeper, it only seemed to rise to the surface stronger than ever. The room was silent, expectant, heavy with the weight of anticipation. Becca stood at the front of the lecture hall, the air thick with the smell of old wood and stale coffee. It was the final presentation, the culmination of years of research. Endless hours spent poring over old manuscripts and examining artifacts in the cold, forgotten corners of the world. Her hands were cold, clammy, but she had prepared for this. She had rehearsed her words, crafted each sentence like an artist, shaping their masterpiece. This was her moment. She stood before a group of her professors, her peers, and a few invited guests, all of whom had been waiting to hear the results of her investigation into the mysterious carvings she had uncovered at the abandoned monastery. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, expectant, skeptical, and yet she couldn't help but feel the faintest stir of excitement. She had spent months studying the first carving, those strange, inexplicable images of a nun and a horse with horns. And now finally, she would show them the truth. She would reveal what had been hidden for so long. The projector hummed to life behind her, and Becca clicked the remote in her hand. The image of the cracked wall from the monastery appeared on the screen, a weathered stone, its surface cracked and scarred by time. The first carving, the one that had started everything, illuminated the wall behind her. The nun, her hand gently placed on the head of the horse, the animal's horns stark against the pale backdrop of the stone. Becca's voice was steady, measured, as she began her presentation. This carving, she began, is one of the most unusual and significant discoveries in this monastery. It speaks to a hidden history, one that challenges our understanding of religious doctrine and human emotion. She paused, letting her words settle. She could feel the tension in the room, the way her audience hung on her every word. But just as she began to delve deeper into the meaning behind the carving, something unexpected happened. A low rumble echoed through the room, barely audible at first, but growing steadily stronger. Becca faltered, glancing toward the back of the room, as the walls of the hall seemed to shudder. The air grew thick with dust. The projector flickered momentarily, distorting the image on the screen. The next thing she knew, the entire back wall behind her gave way with a violent crash. The room gasped in unison as the stone wall collapsed, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Becca staggered back, her heart-racing eyes wide with shock. She couldn't move, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The sound of crumbling stone filled her ears, drowning out the shouts of her peers and professors, their voices lost in the chaos. The dust settled, and slowly the true impact of what had occurred began to unfold. As the cloud of dust cleared, Becca's breath caught in her throat. There, revealed by the fallen stone, was another carving, this one far more startling than the first. The image was unmistakable. The same horse, but this time it was bowing its head beside a symbol that seemed to pierce Becca's heart. A heart cracked clean through the middle, a jagged break cutting it into two halves. The horse's head was bent low in a posture of mourning, a symbol of grief and sorrow, etched forever into the stone. Becca stood frozen in place, her gaze fixed on the image, unable to tear herself away. It was as though time had stopped, as though the entire world had come to a standstill, leaving only her and this brutal, heartbreaking truth. The room was still. No one moved. The professors stared, their faces a mix of disbelief and awe. The silence was deafening. Becca could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she didn't dare turn around. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the weight of the past pressing down on her. This was not just a discovery, it was the revelation of something far greater. It was a secret that had been buried for centuries, and now it was out in the open. And Becca was the one who had uncovered it. She had revealed the truth, but at what cost? The emotional scene. Her mind raced as she stood there, her body numb. She didn't know what to say. The words had fled her. She had imagined this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared her for the shock of seeing that second carving, that symbol of broken love. A part of her felt as though she were the only one who had truly witnessed the significance of this moment. The rest of the room had yet to process what they were seeing, but Becca knew. She knew that what had just been uncovered was more than a simple archaeological find. It was a window into a past filled with pain, regret, and unfulfilled desire. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the professors exchanged glances, their faces now filled with uncertainty. The students, too, were unsure of what to make of the image, their reactions a mix of confusion and awe. But Becca felt as though she were alone in her understanding of what had just been revealed. It wasn't just the image of the horse and the broken heart. It was the realization that this was a story that had been hidden, locked away, and that she had uncovered it. The guilt from the previous weeks, the burden of keeping this secret, suddenly felt unbearable. The truth was out, but what would it mean for her, for them? What would it mean for the rest of the world? The social conflict. I don't understand, one of the professors said, his voice trembling with disbelief. This can't be real. It contradicts everything we know about the history of this monastery. It defies our understanding of religious and cultural values. The room erupted into a chorus of voices, each person trying to process the impossible. Questions were shouted, arguments began to form. The professors and students were divided, some desperately trying to rationalize the find, others balking at the implications. How could this be part of the monastery's history? How could such a thing have been allowed to exist? Becca turned slowly, her eyes falling on Sarah and David, who stood at the back of the room, their faces drawn tight with tension. Sarah's eyes were wide with shock, but Becca could see the disbelief flickering behind them. She knew what Sarah was thinking. She was thinking that this couldn't be true, that it had to be a mistake. It was too much, too impossible. But David? David looked different. His eyes met hers across the room, and for a brief moment Becca could see the understanding in them. He didn't speak, but his gaze was full of a quiet, steady support. In the midst of the chaos, David's presence was a calm anchor. But even he knew that what had just happened would change everything. The room was beginning to spin, and Becca realized that the social conflict had begun. The truth she had uncovered, the love, the grief, the forbidden bond between the nun and the horse, was not something that could simply be accepted. It was too much for the room to bear, too much for the professors, too much for the world that had built its beliefs on rigid structures of faith and history. But in that moment, as Becca stood in front of the ruins of the wall and the shattered truth, she realized that there was no going back. She had uncovered something that no one was ready to face, and yet it was something that needed to be seen. The world would have to reckon with it, just as she had. The day after the discovery, the air seemed heavier. Becca's world had shifted on its axis, and the weight of the revelations buried in the monastery's walls had followed her back to her apartment. The unsettling image of the horse and the broken heart haunted her thoughts, the implications of what she had unearthed, threatening to consume her. She could still hear the whispers in the back of her mind, the voices of those in the room. During the presentation, their disbelief and rejection of the truth she had exposed. But there was one voice that stood out, David's. His silent understanding, the quiet support he had given her in that chaotic moment, had stayed with her like a beacon in the storm. She couldn't rest. She had to know more. She had to understand why the secret had been hidden, why it had been buried for so long. What had driven a woman sworn to a life of chastity and devotion to fall in love with a creature so wild, so forbidden? And why had that love been silenced, left to rot in the shadows of the past? She packed a bag, grabbed her jacket, and headed straight for the old library in the heart of the city. The library had been standing for centuries, its walls crammed with ancient tomes and fragile scrolls. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of aged paper and ink. Becca had been here before, but never with such a singular purpose. She had come for answers for the missing pieces of the puzzle that had haunted her since the moment she first saw the carving on the monastery wall. As she walked through the aisles of the library, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The books here weren't just old. They were relics, carriers of stories long forgotten. Becca moved methodically, scanning the spines of the dusty volumes. Some of the books were written in Latin, others in languages she barely understood. But all were laden with knowledge of the monastery, of its history, and of the people who had lived and died within its walls. She could sense that the answers she sought were buried here, tucked away, in forgotten pages, waiting to be unearthed. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled a heavy book from the shelf. It was a history of the monastery, one that went back centuries, chronicling the lives of the monks and nuns who had once lived there. The pages were yellowed, the edges worn from use. As she flipped through the chapters, the words seemed to blur together. It was a story of devotion, of sacrifice, and of unwavering faith. But there was something in the margins, a notation in faded ink that caught her eye. She leaned in closer, her heart racing. The notation was small but clear. The horse of St. Agnes. Becca's breath caught in her throat. Could this be the key? Was this the connection she had been searching for? She turned the page with trembling hands, eager to discover more. The next passage was even more revealing. St. Agnes, a nun of the old convent known for her piety and commitment to God, was found in the late autumn of 1472, dead in her chambers. Beside her body lay a horse, a magnificent creature of deep black, with horns which no one could explain. It is said that the horse had arrived at the convent the night of her death, as though summoned by some higher power. Some believed the animal was her spirit's guide, others believed it to be a manifestation of her forbidden love. Becca read the passage over and over again, trying to absorb the meaning of the words. The connection was undeniable. This was the same woman, the same horse, and the words were clear forbidden love. But the story didn't end there. The next line sent a shiver down her spine. It is believed that St. Agnes had fallen in love with the horse, an attachment so profound that it defied the very vows she had taken. The convent, in its desperation to keep the secret hidden, buried both Agnes and the horse in a secret grave beneath the convent's foundation, a place where no one would ever find them. Becca's head spun. She had to know more. She couldn't stop now. The truth was right in front of her, yet it was just out of reach. She scanned the next few pages, desperate for more details. But the book grew silent, the pages blank, as though the next chapter had been intentionally torn out, the answers hidden from view. Her mind raced. Who had done this? Who had hidden the truth, and why? She closed the book with a soft thud and picked up another one, this one older and more fragile, bound in dark leather. It was a journal belonging to one of the monks who had lived at the monastery. As she opened the first page, the handwriting was scrawled hastily, as though the writer had been in a hurry or in distress. "The curse of St. Agnes," it began. "The love she felt was forbidden, but it was pure. The horse understood her in a way no one else could. She spoke to it in secret in whispers, hoping for a love she could never express. When she was caught, the abbey took drastic measures to keep the scandal quiet." Becca's breath caught in her throat as she read the journal's details. The love between the nun and the horse was more than just a secret. It was something that had been deliberately erased from history. The abbey had done everything it could to bury the truth, to hide the love that had dared to exist outside the rules of faith. Inner conflict. As Becca read on, her own emotions began to churn. What she was uncovering was more than just a story. It was a mirror to the world she lived in now. A world where love was still seen as something that could be controlled, something that could be dictated by societal and religious norms. Becca had always believed in the power of truth, in the importance of exposing secrets, no matter how painful. But now she was faced with a question that threatened to unravel everything she believed. Could she be the one to expose this truth? Could she be the one to break the silence that had lasted for centuries? The deeper she delved into the story, the more she understood the gravity of her discovery. St. Agnes's love had been crushed by the very institution that was meant to protect her. Her love had been deemed unworthy, sinful. And yet, it had been real, so real, that it had transcended the boundaries of life and death, existing as a love that no one had dared to speak of until now. Becca's heart felt heavy in her chest. She was caught between two worlds, the one she had known with its rigid boundaries and expectations, and the one she was beginning to see, a world where love was free to exist in its truest, purest form, regardless of the rules. Psychological transformation. As Becca sat there in the dim light of the library, surrounded by the weight of centuries of history, she began to understand something fundamental about herself. Her journey into this hidden history had not only unearthed the truth of the past, it had unearthed a truth about her own heart. Love, she realized, was not something that could be controlled, not something that could be suppressed by societal or cultural norms. It was something wild, untamed, and in many ways, sacred. Becca had spent so long living in the confines of what was expected of her, living for others, living by rules, living in fear of being judged. But now, standing on the precipice of a truth that was both painful and beautiful, she felt her own perspective shift. She didn't have to live in fear. She didn't have to hide who she was or what she believed in. Love was not something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, even when it defied the rules. With this realization, Becca understood that she could no longer keep the secret. She could no longer allow the truth of St. Agnes and the horse to be buried in the past. She had to share it. She had to tell the world that love in all its forms was something worth fighting for. The room was filled with a quiet murmur, the kind that filled the air just before something monumental happened. Becca stood behind the podium, her hands trembling as she adjusted her notes. The weight of everything that had happened, everything she had uncovered, felt heavier now than it ever had before. Her heart raced, and yet there was a calmness that settled within her, an unexpected peace. She had spent so many days questioning her choices, questioning whether revealing the truth was worth the consequences. But now, standing before an audience that had gathered for her final presentation, she knew that it was time. The truth would be set free. Today wasn't just about facts. It wasn't just about ancient history. It was about something much deeper. It was about love, about sacrifice, about breaking free from the chains that bound us, even when society tells us to suppress the deepest parts of ourselves. The auditorium was packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Professors, students, and members of the community sat waiting to hear the culmination of Becca's work. The projector hummed in the background, the first image of the nun and the horse flashing up on the screen. The same image she had first discovered, the one that had haunted her dreams, the one that had opened the door to everything that had followed. Becca took a deep breath and began to speak. This story is not just about a carving on a wall. She began, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of emotion that she couldn't quite hide. It's a story of sacrifice, of love, that transcends all boundaries, of a woman who defied the very world she lived in to experience something pure and beautiful. Her eyes flickered to the screen as the image of the horse and the broken heart appeared. St. Agnes, a woman who had taken a vow of chastity, was in love with a horse. An impossible love. A forbidden love. A love that in her time could never be understood. Becca paused, letting the words hang in the air. But what I've discovered through this journey is that real love cannot be confined by rules or the walls we build around ourselves. She glanced out over the audience, her gaze steady as she continued. St. Agnes sacrificed everything. She gave up her vows, her life of service, because she found a connection that was deeper than anything else she had known. And that love, no matter how much it was hidden, no matter how much it was condemned, was real. The horse understood her in ways no human could. And in return, it gave her a kind of solace, a kind of peace that no one else could. The room was silent now. Becca could feel the weight of the silence, the way the words had struck deep into the hearts of those who listened. She could feel their gaze on her, the collective energy of everyone waiting for what came next. Over the centuries, Becca continued, her voice growing stronger. The truth of their love was buried. It was hidden because it didn't fit the narrative of what society wanted to hear. It didn't fit into the box that was created for them. But the truth doesn't disappear. It only waits. She paused again, taking in the room, her heart swelling with emotion. And now we're here, all of us together, to hear this story. To let the truth out. To let it breathe. The audience was still. But Becca could see their faces change, could feel the shift in the room. Some looked stunned, others shocked, but many looked moved. She wasn't sure if it was because of the story or because they were beginning to understand the depth of what it meant. The transformation. Becca's voice softened as she moved into the final part of her presentation. What St. Agnes experienced was a love that transcended every barrier. It was pure. It was undeniable. And though it was hidden away for so long, it's still here. It lives in the truth we're telling today. And that truth about love, about freedom, about breaking free from the walls we build around ourselves is something we all can learn from. She looked up at the crowd, seeing the different expressions on their faces. The professors were silent, their eyes narrowed as if trying to reconcile their understanding of history with what Becca was saying. Others in the crowd, students, perhaps looked inspired, their eyes wide, as though a door had opened for them. I know this truth is hard to accept, Becca said, her voice growing more impassioned. But if we hide from it, if we continue to suppress it, then we only perpetuate the suffering that comes from living a life that is not our own. We need to be brave enough to let love be what it is, untamed, wild, and free. There was a pause as she let the words sink in. The room, once filled with skepticism and quiet chatter, was now still. Becca stood in front of them, not just as a student sharing research, but as a person who had uncovered something deeply personal. Something that had connected her to the past and to herself in ways she hadn't expected. The social impact. As Becca finished her presentation, there was a long silence in the room. Then slowly, a single clap echoed from the back of the auditorium. It was followed by another, then another. One by one, the audience rose to their feet, applause rippling through the room, growing louder and more enthusiastic with each passing moment. Becca's heart raced as she stood there, feeling the weight of their recognition and the depth of what she had just shared. The applause wasn't just for the discovery. It wasn't just for the research. It was for the message, for the truth, for the love that had been buried and was now free. As Becca stepped down from the podium, her legs trembling, she felt a profound sense of relief, of peace. It was as if something that had been locked inside her for so long had been set free. She wasn't just telling a story anymore. She was giving others the permission to be free as well. David was the first to approach her, his face soft with admiration. You did it, he said, his voice low and full of emotion. You told them. Becca nodded, her eyes bright with tears. I had to tell the truth. It wasn't just for her, she said, her voice catching. It was for all of us. Sarah, too, approached her expression more thoughtful than before. I didn't understand it at first, she said, her voice hesitant. But now, I see it. I see what you meant. Becca smiled, the weight of everything lifting off her shoulders. Thank you. Thank you for listening. The applause continued as more people came to congratulate her. But Becca didn't feel the need for validation anymore. She had set the truth free, and in doing so, she had liberated herself, and perhaps even others. In that moment, she understood. Love in all its forms was not something to hide. It was not something to be ashamed of. Love was the truth, and the truth had set them all free.